May we then move forward to item 5 on the agenda, which is the paper on conflicts of interest. I'm going to invite Bruce Keogh to introduce it along with Ian Dodge, and then we'll open up the paper for broader discussion. Bruce, please.
Thanks very much, Chairman. You'll recall that in 2015 we set out guidance for commissioners on conflicts of interest, with particular respect to CCGs. And at our board meeting in March 2016, we agreed to extend that to a much wider audience across the NHS. And Ian will describe the process that we followed for that and which you chaired. But it was driven, I think, by a number of influences which are beginning to emerge. And in no specific order, there's been changes in the approach to this in the United States, driven in part by the Sunshine Act. That has driven changes with the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry. There's growing public and media interest in conflicts of interest. And of course, there are also issues related to procurement rules and transparency. So all of these things have come together, I think, to mean that the time is right for the NHS to have clarity over how we approach conflicts of interest. And the document which you have before you, from my point of view, I think has probably 3 strengths. The first lies in its simplicity. It attempts to set out a number of common issues, to define a set of principles which in turn will translate into a set of behaviors that are expected of both individuals and organizations. The second thing is it's an attempt to align with professional guidance that already exists, with principles of public life, with the Competition and Markets Authority guidelines, and also with changing pharma and medical device guidelines as they start to emerge. But the third thing I think it does is it tries to acknowledge the evolving environment in which this process has happened, in part driven again by the pharmaceutical and device industry, and also by some emerging evidence that the relationships that are developed between the pharma industry and people conducting trials, the very nature and construct of those may actually, in some instances, influence the outcomes of trials. So this is a complex and changing environment. So this is a first attempt, really, for the NHS to define a set of principles, rules that will underpin a set of behaviours which should, if done properly, protect both organisations and individuals from imputation of false motive. I think we need to be clear that this environment will continue to change. This is not the final word, and I would imagine we'll go through an iterative process as we seek to understand exactly what conflicts of interest mean for people in the NHS.
Thank you, Bruce. Ian.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for laying out the context so clearly. I think there are 4 purposes behind this work, one of which is protecting the taxpayer's interest, secondly, maintaining public trust, thirdly, supporting NHS employers, and fourthly, protecting staff themselves. And the way in which we sought to achieve those objectives is by articulating and codifying what is good practice, so that we make the task of dealing with conflicts of interest simpler for people in the NHS. And that rather than everyone have to invent for themselves marginally different policies and ways of complying with those policies, we reduce the transaction costs and burdens through a process of standardization and simplification. As you've explained, Bruce, work on conflicts of interest is not an unexplored terrain. And this most recent process builds on three things. It builds on the first ever statutory guidance for CCGs, which we developed particularly within the context of the heightened risk associated with the delegation of the commissioning of primary medical care services to CCGs. It picks up as well on the changes in the NHS standard contract, which now apply. And it also builds on the very encouraging work that has been led by the pharmaceutical industry under the auspices of the ABPI called Disclosure UK, which was kick-started in the summer of last year. The process we've gone through under Sir Malcolm's chairmanship is to convene a broad-based task and finish group comprised of key members of the professions, the national arm's length bodies, representative bodies, and indeed industry representatives. We produced in September of last year a set of proposals for public consultation. And then we've gone through a process of very careful consideration of the 250 responses that were submitted, in the light of which the Task and Finish Group has decided upon a number of, I think, important modifications in the light of the constructive challenge that's received. And I just wanted to place on record obviously the thanks to those who have responded to the consultation to help us improve the final product. Today, this morning, we have now published revised guidance of that group, and it also includes an analysis of the consultation responses. We have set out clear proposals on gifts, on hospitality, on employment, on donations. And I particularly wanted to highlight three areas where there is some change from the original proposition. So first of all, on the scope, we have clarified that this guidance applies specifically to NHS providers. We commend it to other organisations who are delivering service under contract to the NHS. But we've been keen to make sure that we do not impose disproportionate burden, particularly on small organisations with their own separate governance arrangements and indeed the professional codes of conduct that provide additional public protection, because we haven't wanted to impose unnecessary burdens on those small providers. Secondly, we heard very clear feedback that our definition of senior staff was pitched at slightly the wrong level, and that we've therefore amended that to apply to band 8Ds and above rather than 8Cs. And then thirdly, on clinical private practice, we've heard some support for the underlying principle, but also a very clear message that the specific way in which we were proposing to capture that principle was not the best route to proceed. So what we're doing in this guidance is we're setting out something which is comparable to the way in which other non-clinical staff have to declare their time commitment to outside interests. The guidance will come into effect on the 1st of June. We are developing with our partners a suite of templates and standard material to make it easy for NHS organisations to comply, and we will keep under review the effect. And with that, Chairman, I invite the board to fully endorse the guidance.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce and Ian. I had the privilege of chairing the Task and Finish group. I just actually say, in my experience, it was very unusual to have such a coterminosity of views between the industry and the NHS. And I think with the regulators on board as well and the other arm's length bodies, it was possible to do a job that we couldn't have done on our own, and to really try to create a regime of relatively uniform principles, actually quite uniform principles, but reasonably uniform rules as well across a very large sector of activity. Because there's no point in having one set of rules for the NHS and one set of rules for the industry, and creating not only confusion but also opportunity for avoidance. So I think it's been an important exercise for us. So let me, if I may, open up the paper for discussion by colleagues. I have Wendy, please.
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously a critical context and not a new one, and a very extensive process. I'd be curious at the end of all of that, what do you think are going to be the biggest changes coming out of the implementation of this work?
I think it'll be a set of behaviours which I think will mean greater transparency, and I think organisations will focus, I think, more clearly on where conflicts of interests may occur in a way that will protect both them and their staff from those potential accusations.
May I add, I think what this process is doing is shining a light on an area that people are conscious is something that needs to be addressed, but haven't necessarily given it the attention that it deserves. And what we, I think, have done is found a way of making it easy for organisations and individuals to actually follow good practice. And then we will see during the course of the next months the extent to which we've had that effect.
So clearly, very in-depth, very solid piece of work. I guess I'm sort of wondering a bit about sort of how will we know if it's had the desired effect? And you mentioned that this was on a journey. So what's the review process to be able to look at that desired effect against the objectives and then determine whether further changes are needed?
One of the main ways in which we will know is the public material that is made available from NHS organisations, both the CCGs and indeed the providers, that is available to the public that shows how well they're complying with the guidance. And what we will be doing is looking and keeping under review what that's telling us. I mean, if I could pick up the example on CCG statutory guidance, where the process predates this work, one of the things we've set out really clearly there is the requirement to publish policies and processes. Those then have been subject to audit by the CCGs themselves, and it is possible for the public to actually go onto the NHS websites and see the extent to which those have been effectively followed, David. So I think we will need to kind of see how the transparency is working, and then what more, if anything, we need to do to support NHS organisations to be able to adhere to the rules effectively.
And Ian, will we be expecting, as we did with CCGs, and have put in place, that there will be internal and external audit review of whether the processes have been complied with? Or are we leaving that to the judgment of individual organisations?
We have taken a really clear line for CCGs because of the particular risk there. But for the other organisations, we aren't, I believe, mandating formal audit, but we will be keeping the process under review.
We might want to think.
Whereas clearly, I mean, guidance like this is never self-implementing. Tempting though it always would be to believe that from where we sit. I think if you read the responses, and there are extensive responses, there's a very good summary actually in the papers the board's got. I wouldn't say there's a ravenous appetite for this, but there's certainly quite a lot of desire to have a uniform system which is more uniformly implemented and observed. I think there's another issue here, which is that as we are as we are bringing about a series of changes across the NHS which involve new models of care, new models of partnership, new relationships between different organisations, so the premium on identifying where potential conflicts might occur, recognising them and recording them up front, I think is a very important safeguard which gives a larger measure of security to those who are, on our behalf, entering into these new ventures. So I think that Ian's absolutely right. We need to be overseeing what's happening. I have a much more acute instances of it, obviously, within CCGs, but more generally, I think this is an opportunity to support people and not merely to have this perceived as yet another bureaucratic burden. It's emphatically not that. Right, let me take Moira.
I'm just going to say that I think obviously what we're trying to ensure is that the public can be reassured that organisations, individuals and arrangements are more trustworthy. And I do want to underscore David's point about audit in due course having taking an interest in these. But I think we should also recognise that it's unlikely that the public will have more trust, because the very nature of making it transparent encourages people to think there's something going wrong. And so in terms of Wendy's question about what change, we certainly shouldn't seek to measure it in terms of public trust, because I think that won't be changed by this, or might in fact go in the wrong direction.
I think that's an absolutely valid point. If you take the example of Disclosure UK, where there has been quite a bit of resistance to clinicians and others declaring the payments that they've received from the pharmaceutical industry. The danger of not declaring it is actually that when it is discovered and becomes public, then there is an opportunity for imputation of false motive. I think that the critical thing that has come about is to be able to defend the fact that clinicians are not receiving bribes from the pharmaceutical industry, they're actually performing valuable services. And this needs to be reflected in the way in which the receipt is declared. So we would push very hard for 100% observance of the rules that have been introduced by the AVPI under Disclosure UK. And it, I think, has the dual purpose of being able to be clear about why money is being paid, and also being able to be clear that there is nothing being hidden from public view. May we take other comments? Ian?
In response to your observation, Maura, I think there's a phasing point here, that as we end up achieving greater coverage of disclosure, you are indeed right that there is a greater risk of an undermining of public trust. However, as that process completes, and as Bruce says, there is a journey we're going on, actually the intention is that it will end up providing a greater degree of certainty for the public. And I think that is likely to be the outcome, but it will be a non-linear journey.
Yes, I don't know of many linear journeys in any of the work that we do, so that's not a surprising conclusion for us. On that basis, may I invite the board to endorse the publication of the guidance? We note that there will be a lot of interest in its implementation, and we should create an audit trail to ensure that it has the effect that we wish it to have. Is that agreed? Okay.